When my daughter-in-law called me a creepy old woman behind my back and then served me with legal papers banning me from seeing my own grandson, she thought she'd won. What she didn't know was that this quiet grandmother had a PhD in psychology and was about to turn her own manipulation tactics against her. By the time I walked into that courtroom, I had documented every lie, every cruel word, every moment she'd hurt that little boy. And when they called Dr. Dorothy Gable to the witness stand, the look on her face was absolutely priceless. You won't believe how this grandmother dismantled a master manipulator with nothing but facts and a forgotten degree. The thing about a child's birthday party is that it's never really for the child. Not anymore, anyway. Liam's 6th birthday party was a full-blown production, a testament to my daughter-in-law Chloe's talent for performance. Our little suburban cul-de-sac had never seen anything like it. There were themed balloons, a professional-looking banner that read, "Liam is 6," and a dozen other parents sipping iced tea from mason jars, all of them marveling at what a wonderful, dedicated mother Chloe was. She moved through the crowd like a seasoned director, adjusting a decoration here, laughing at a parent's joke there, all while keeping a hawk's eye on my grandson. I arrived with what I thought was the most important thing, a chocolate cake with fudgy frosting, the kind Liam had been talking about for weeks. I'd spent all morning baking it, the familiar comfort of measuring flour and sugar, filling my quiet kitchen. When I presented it to Chloe, her smile was dazzlingly bright. She thanked me profusely, calling me the best grandma in the world, and then placed my humble lopsided cake on a side table far from the main event. A moment later, she unveiled the centerpiece, a 3-tiered monstrosity from a fancy bakery airbrushed with cartoon dogs and an edible fortress. All the parents gasped in appreciation. Liam, of course, was thrilled by the spectacle. I just smiled and found a seat in the corner, my cake sitting alone like a forgotten relative. From my vantage point, I watched. It's what I'd been doing for months now, observing the subtle shifts in the family dynamic. I watched as Liam, about to answer a question from another child, flicked his eyes toward his mother, a silent, split-second check for approval. I saw Chloe with that same brilliant smile steer him away from me when I tried to show him the new birdwatching book I'd brought him. She'd told me gently that he was getting a bit overstimulated and needed a moment, her hand a firm barrier on his small shoulder. Her actions were all so reasonable on the surface, so easy to explain away. But I couldn't unhear my son Mark's voice from the night before, a desperate, hushed whisper over the phone after Chloe was asleep. He'd told me she was getting worse, that she'd started telling Liam his nightmares were because of the strange ideas Grandma Dorothy put in his head. Mark felt so helpless, caught in the middle of a war he didn't know how to fight. He said he was sorry, and the guilt in his voice was an old, familiar ache in my own chest. So I sat there, a quiet, accommodating grandma, and played my part. I clapped when Liam blew out the candles on the fortress cake. I smiled at the other parents. I tried not to let the growing coldness in my heart show on my face. As the party wound down and the last of the guests trickled out, I began to help clean up a habit from a lifetime of being useful. I went to retrieve my untouched cake from its lonely post. As I reached for the cake carrier, I heard Chloe's voice from the kitchen, her tone light and conspiratorial, completely different from the strained sweetness she'd used all day. She was on the phone, no doubt recounting her successful event to a friend. I froze my hand hovering over the plastic lid. Her words drifted through the doorway, sharp and clear as shattered glass. She laughed, a genuine throaty sound I hadn't heard in years. She told her friend that, yes, he was totally buying it, that he really thought Grandma Dorothy was a bad influence on him. Then came the words that stopped the air in my lungs. She said that with just a few more months of this, he wouldn't even want to see the creepy old woman at all. For 3 days after the party, I existed in a state of cold, quiet shock. The echo of Chloe's words, "creepy old woman," played on a loop in my mind. The initial searing pain of it had cooled into something harder and heavier. It was a strange kind of grief, not for a person, but for the possibility of a family that was now clearly an illusion. I had spent years accommodating Chloe's moods, her anxieties, her ever-shifting rules, all for the sake of my son and my grandson. I'd told myself her behavior was the anxiety of a new mother, the stress of a difficult divorce. I had diagnosed from a distance, always giving her the benefit of the doubt. But hearing that laughter, that casual, cruel dismissal of my love for Liam, that wasn't anxiety. That was strategy. The doorbell rang on Thursday afternoon. It wasn't the mailman or a neighbor. It was a young man in a polo shirt that was too tight, holding a clipboard and a crisp, legal-sized envelope. He asked if I was Dorothy Gable, and when I said yes, he handed me the envelope, had me sign his clipboard, and left without another word. I knew even before I opened it that this was Chloe's next move. My hands were perfectly steady as I slit the seal. The paper inside was thick, expensive. It was a formal cease and desist letter drafted by a downtown law firm. It was filled with dense legal jargon, but the message was brutally simple. I was accused of causing significant emotional distress to a minor child. My behavior was described as an unstable influence. I was in no uncertain terms legally forbidden from contacting my own grandson. Every line was a calculated twist of the knife, painting me as a monster, a threat. I read it twice, the clinical and cruel language settling not with a bang, but with a quiet, decisive click in my mind. The part of my brain that had been dormant for 30 years, the part that had earned a PhD analyzing family systems and personality disorders, slowly began to wake up. As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Mark. His voice was thin and ragged with panic. He'd gotten a copy of the letter, too. He told me it was over, that she'd finally done it. He said she was building a legal case against us, that he'd never get more custody now that he was going to lose Liam for good. He was spiraling the way he always did when Chloe launched one of her campaigns. For years, she had chipped away at his confidence, framing his love for his son as interference and his concerns as attacks. He was exhausted, and I could hear the sound of a man who was ready to surrender. And that's when it happened. As my son's voice cracked with despair, a profound and unshakable calm settled over me. The emotional fog vanished, replaced by a crystalline clarity. The hurt, the shock, the grandmotherly grief, it all receded. The psychologist took over. I cut through his panicked rambling. My voice, when I spoke, surprised even me. It was low, measured, and completely steady. I told him to listen to me, to just take a breath. I let the silence hang for a second before I continued. I explained that she had not won. In fact, I told him she had just made a grave tactical error. She had documented her own pathology. I could almost feel his confusion through the phone. I told him not to worry. I said she had just given us our foundational evidence. I let the words dredged up from old textbooks and lecture halls come to me. I explained that this was a classic case of projective identification. It's when a person unable to tolerate their own feelings of inadequacy or instability projects those feelings onto someone else and then manipulates the situation to make that person feel and act in a way that confirms the projection. She needed me to be the unstable one to feel stable herself. And now I told Mark she had put it in writing. He was quiet for a long moment. The panic in his breathing had subsided, replaced by bewilderment. I didn't give him time to question it. I gave him a task, a first step on a new path. I told him to go to the office supply store right now and buy a legal ledger, the kind with numbered pages. I told him we were starting a formal observation log and that I would email him the precise formatting for documenting every single interaction with her from this moment forward. After I hung up with Mark, I sat at my kitchen table and composed a text message to Chloe. I typed it, deleted it, and retyped it until it was perfect. It was polite. It was detached. It was professional. It simply said that I acknowledged receipt of the letter from her attorney and that all future correspondence regarding the matter should be directed to my legal counsel. I hit send. I imagined her reading it, expecting a flood of furious, tearful voicemails. Instead, she got a quiet, impenetrable wall. She had wanted a hysterical old woman. She was about to meet a doctor. My text message was a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples were felt in the one way they could be: silence. There were no furious phone calls, no barrage of angry texts, not even a message passed through my son. Chloe simply went quiet. I knew her well enough to understand what that meant. In her mind, she had won. She had fired her cannon, and in the absence of a return volley, she assumed her enemy had been sunk. My silence was not a strategy to her. It was a white flag of surrender. Mark confirmed as much. He told me her whole demeanor had changed. She became magnanimous, benevolent even. She was suddenly so reasonable, allowing him an extra hour on his weekends with Liam, speaking to him in a tone of sweet, condescending pity, as if he were a child who had finally learned his lesson. I knew this tactic. It was about establishing a new baseline of control, demonstrating that life was so much more pleasant now that the problem me had been dealt with. Her victory lap, of course, was held online. She began posting a curated series of passive-aggressive quotes on her social media. Images of sunsets and blooming flowers were paired with captions about the importance of protecting your child's peace from toxic influences. There were posts about how true family doesn't manipulate and how setting boundaries is the highest form of self-care. It was all so vague, so deniable. To the world, she was a wise, healing mother. To me, it was a public execution by 1,000 paper cuts. She was building her narrative brick by brick, painting herself as the victim and me as the villain. She had no idea I was building something too. While she was curating her online persona, I was in my attic, surrounded by the ghosts of a former life. I found the box I was looking for, tucked under a pile of old photo albums. It was sealed with brittle yellowed tape and labeled in my own handwriting, U of C, 1988. The air inside smelled of dust and old paper. I carefully lifted out my doctoral diploma, my name printed in elegant script, Dorothy Gable, PhD. Beneath it was my bound dissertation, its title, Dense and Academic: Coercive Control and Attachment Theory in Dysfunctional Family Systems. I ran my fingers over the embossed letters. It felt like I was reintroducing myself to a woman I had long since forgotten. For the next 2 weeks, my quiet, retired life became a research project. My kitchen table was covered not with cookbooks, but with my old academic texts, their margins filled with my own notes. I spent hours rereading the work of Bowlby Minuchin, and others the clinical language coming back to me like a half-remembered song. The muscle memory of my profession was surprisingly strong. I knew I couldn't do this alone, though. I needed to know how this would play in a legal setting, not just an academic one. I spent an afternoon tracking down a number for an old colleague, Dr. Anya Sharma. We had been in the doctoral program together, but she had gone into forensic psychology, testifying in custody cases. When I finally got her on the phone, I explained the situation not as a heartbroken grandmother, but as a fellow professional presenting a case study. Anya listened patiently and then gave me invaluable advice. She told me how to structure my observations to use the BIFF model: brief, informative, friendly, and firm, in any necessary communication. She advised me to focus on observable behaviors and their impact on the child, not on my own feelings. That phone call was a turning point. It armed me with a modern framework for my old knowledge. My other partner in this was Mark. Our nightly phone calls became strategic coaching sessions. At first, he would just call to vent his frustration about something Chloe had done. I let him, but then I would gently guide him. I told him never to argue. Instead, he was to ask clarifying questions. I gave him scripts, phrases like, "Can you help me understand why that's a rule now?" Or, "What is the specific concern you have about that book?" Then the most important part, I told him to document everything in the ledger I'd had him buy. The date, the time, the exact words Chloe used, and a brief note about Liam's mood before and after the interaction. Slowly, I saw a change in my son. His despair was being replaced by a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a victim of Chloe's whims. He was a researcher collecting data. He was a co-conspirator. As the pages of his ledger started to fill up, a grim satisfaction settled in my heart. Chloe was so secure in her victory, so busy polishing her halo for the public, that she had no idea we were quietly building a fortress of facts, one documented, dated, and undeniable observation at a time. The mediation was held in a sterile, windowless conference room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and quiet desperation. The polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of everyone present. There was Chloe dressed in a soft, cream-colored suit, the very picture of wounded reason. Beside her sat her lawyer, a man with a smug, self-satisfied air. Across from them was my son Mark, his knuckles white where he gripped his pen, but his jaw was set with a resolve I hadn't seen in years. Beside him, his lawyer, Ms. Davies, was a picture of sharp, focused competence. At the head of the table sat the mediator, a man named Mr. Peterson, whose calm, impassive face gave nothing away. And then there was me. I was dressed in a simple lavender cardigan and gray slacks. I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, a quiet, harmless grandmother from Wisconsin. Chloe's lawyer began. It was a masterful performance of righteous indignation. He painted a picture of a loving single mother trying desperately to protect her son from an increasingly erratic and unstable grandmother. He presented my carefully worded text message as a cold and threatening communication. He brought up the birthday party, twisting my homemade cake into an act of passive aggression, and my attempt at a hug into an overwhelming emotional demand on a fragile child. He spoke of my unhealthy influence, my inappropriate gifts, my refusal to respect Chloe's boundaries. As he spoke, Chloe would dab at her eyes with a tissue at precisely the right moments, a perfect damsel in distress. To anyone who didn't know the truth, it would have been a compelling story. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, and let him build his stage. When he finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Mr. Peterson made a few notes and then looked at Ms. Davies. My son's lawyer gave a small, calm smile. She said that they had a very different perspective on these events, and they had just one witness they'd like to call to provide that context. The mediator nodded, expectant. Ms. Davies straightened her papers. She said that given the serious accusations regarding the psychological well-being of the child, they felt it was appropriate to call an expert witness on the subject of family systems and child psychology. Then she looked directly at me. She said the defense would like to call Dr. Dorothy Gable to the stand. The shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute. Chloe, who had been looking down with an expression of sorrowful dignity, looked up sharply. A short, disbelieving laugh escaped her lips before she choked it back. Her lawyer frowned, flipping through his papers as if he'd missed something vital. Mark sat up a little straighter, a flicker of something triumphant in his eyes. The mediator. Mr. Peterson raised his eyebrows, his professional impassivity finally cracking. He looked at me, truly, looked at me for the first time, and I met his gaze without blinking. I stood and walked to the chair Ms. Davies indicated. From my simple grandmotherly tote bag, I retrieved not a wallet or a bundle of tissues, but a slim, professional folio. Ms. Davies began by establishing my credentials, her voice clear and formal. She asked me to state my qualifications for the record. I looked at the mediator and calmly listed my doctorate in child psychology from the University of Chicago, my specialization in developmental trauma, and my 17 years of past clinical practice in family systems therapy. The smug look on Chloe's lawyer's face dissolved. Chloe herself went pale. Ms. Davies then began her surgical dismantling of their narrative. She'd ask me a question, and I would provide the clinical framework. Was my text message threatening? I explained the well-established low contact and BIFF communication models. Brief, informative, friendly, firm, recommended for de-escalating conflict in co-parenting situations. My text, I noted, was a textbook example of that healthy strategy. What about the accusation of being a bad influence? I defined parental alienation syndrome for Mr. Peterson. I described it as a cluster of behaviors where one parent systematically undermines a child's relationship with another loving family member. I stated that baseless accusations of being a bad influence, a danger, or unstable are primary indicators of this syndrome. One by one, we went through their points. The birthday party was a classic example of gatekeeping, controlling a child's access to other family members. The criticism of my gifts was an attempt to undermine gestures of affection. My voice never wavered. I wasn't an angry grandmother. I was a professional delivering an assessment. I was a doctor diagnosing a disease. Chloe could not stay silent. She started interrupting, her voice rising in pitch. She said I was twisting everything, that I was the one playing mind games. Her lawyer tried to quiet her, but the panic had set in. She looked at the mediator, her eyes wide with desperation, and insisted that she was just trying to be a good mother. Mr. Peterson held up a hand, his expression now one of intense focus. He told Chloe he would give her a chance to respond later, but for now, he wanted to hear the rest of my testimony. The mask of the calm, reasonable victim had been shattered, and what lay beneath was raw, flailing panic. Her outburst was more damning than anything I could have said. Ms. Davies looked at me, and I gave a slight nod. She turned back to the mediator. She said this was merely a brief summary of my initial professional observations. She explained that for the past several weeks, I had been compiling a full report. Then, with a quiet deliberation that seemed to suck all the air out of the room, she reached into her briefcase, pulled out the 2-inch binder-bound report I had given her, and placed it on the polished table with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. The heavy binder sat on the table between us all, an irrefutable fact in a room built on fiction. Mr. Peterson, the mediator, looked at it, then at Ms. Davies, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was time. Ms. Davies opened the binder, handing a copy to Mr. Peterson and another to Chloe's lawyer, who took it as if it were radioactive. He began flipping through it, his smug expression from earlier now replaced by a mask of growing horror. Ms. Davies began to walk Mr. Peterson through the assessment, her voice calm and methodical. She started with what we called the observation log. This was the ledger Mark had so diligently kept. She read excerpts aloud, her voice ringing in the quiet room. She read the entry from the week Chloe decided Liam could no longer eat carbohydrates after 6 p.m., a rule that vanished 2 days later. She read the entry where Chloe told Liam that his father was sad and lonely because Grandma didn't love him anymore. She read entry after entry, a timeline of gaslighting, of contradictory rules, of conversations, designed to instill loyalty through guilt. Each one was dated timed and followed by Mark's brief notes on Liam's subsequent emotional state. Anxious at bedtime, asked if Daddy was mad at him, cried for no reason. Next, she turned to the behavioral checklist. I explained to Mr. Peterson that this was a standardized assessment tool used in family psychology to identify patterns of alienating behavior. I explained each item as Ms. Davies read it aloud. Does the parent regularly denigrate the other parent or their family? Does the parent limit contact and communication without due cause? Does the parent confide inappropriate adult information to the child? Does the parent force the child to choose or keep secrets? With each question, I could see Chloe shrinking in her chair. At the end of the section, Ms. Davies stated the final score, and I explained its clinical significance, noting that it fell squarely in the range, indicating a severe pattern of parental alienation. But it was the final section that broke her. We called it the impact assessment. This was where we connected her behavior to its effect on my grandson. Ms. Davies read from a report from Liam's schoolteacher noting his recent social withdrawal. She read from Mark's log about the return of his childhood bedwetting. She presented a timeline that showed a clear correlation following a weekend where Chloe had heavily criticized Liam would have nightmares for 2 nights. After Chloe had called me a bad influence at his party, he began telling his school friends that his other grandma was creepy. I cited 3 different peer-reviewed studies on the long-term psychological damage of such emotional manipulation on a child's ability to form secure attachments. That was the breaking point. It was one thing to be accused of being a bad daughter-in-law. It was another to be confronted with the undeniable documented harm she was causing her own son. Chloe began to shake her head, whispering that it wasn't true, that we were lying, twisting things. Her whispers grew into sobs, then into something much more raw and ragged. The polished, perfect mother dissolved, and all that was left was the terrified, inadequate woman she'd been hiding. She threw her hands on the table, her voice a desperate wail that filled the room. She cried out that we didn't understand that he was all she had, that her own mother had told her every single day how worthless she was, and she just couldn't have Liam hate her too. She accused us of trying to take him away, the one good thing, the only person in the world who she was sure loved her. It was a full confession, not of malice, but of a deep, cavernous fear. Her entire strategy, her whole campaign of cruelty, was nothing more than a desperate, clumsy attempt to hoard the love she was terrified of losing. In that moment, watching her completely fall apart, I felt no triumph. There was no satisfaction. All I felt was a profound, aching sadness for everyone in that room, for the generational trauma that had led us here. I looked at her not as an adversary, but as the subject of a tragedy. I leaned forward slightly, and my voice was soft when I spoke. I told her that no one wanted Liam to hate her. I told her that we all just wanted him to be healthy. And the behaviors in that report, I said, were not healthy. It was over. The compassionate truth was more devastating than any angry accusation could ever have been. Mr. Peterson was silent for a long time. He looked at the weeping Chloe, at her stunned lawyer, at my son's stoic, pained face, and finally at me. He closed the binder in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was filled with a heavy, solemn authority. He stated that the evidence presented was comprehensive, credible, and deeply concerning. His recommendation, he said, was for an immediate transfer of primary physical and legal custody to the father, Mark Gable. He continued stating that Chloe would be granted supervised visitation twice a month at a professional facility. This, he said, was contingent on her immediate enrollment in and active participation with a court-approved therapist specializing in family conflict. His final words were not for her, but for the principle of the matter. He said the court's goal was never to punish a parent, but always to protect the child. Mark's hand found my shoulder, and he squeezed a silent, heavy acknowledgement of the battle we had just won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of a long, painful surgery. The disease had been cut out, but the scars would remain for a long, long time. The month following the mediation felt like the world slowly regaining its color. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety that had been my companion for years finally went silent. The new reality wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet. It was the sound of a peaceful afternoon at Mark's apartment, an apartment that was now truly a home. I sat in a comfortable armchair, a half-finished cup of tea, cooling beside me, simply watching my son and my grandson. They were on the living room floor, surrounded by a sprawling city of colorful plastic bricks. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells. Liam's laughter, when it came, was loud and unrestrained, the pure, joyful sound of a little boy who wasn't afraid of taking up space. Mark would laugh with him, his own face relaxed and free from the constant strain that had carved lines into it for years. This was the spoils of our war, not victory, but peace. The simple, beautiful, boring peace of a normal Saturday afternoon. The subject of Chloe was no longer a forbidden, explosive topic. We spoke of her with a kind of gentle, somber distance. Mark had to take Liam for his supervised visits twice a month at a family resource center, the same building where Chloe had her mandated therapy sessions. One evening, Mark told me he'd seen her on his way out. He said she looked different, smaller somehow. The sharp defensive angles of her posture had softened. She wasn't smiling, but the practiced mask of victimhood was gone too. In its place was just a profound tiredness. He said she'd met his eyes for a brief moment, and for the first time he saw no accusation there. There was no anger, no manipulation, just a flicker of something that looked like sad, quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness or a miraculous cure. It was just the first tentative step on a long, uncertain road. It was enough to let us know that the woman we'd faced in that room was perhaps finally facing herself. It allowed a sliver of compassion to enter my heart, a hope that she might one day find peace for her own sake, not just for ours. My own life had changed too. The strategist, the doctor, the woman who had unearthed a 30-year-old degree to fight for her family, was finally able to rest. One afternoon, Liam asked if we could bake a cake, a real one, not a pretend one. And so we stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had baked the sad rejected cake for his birthday party. This time, though, it was different. We made an absolute mess. There was flour on my glasses and a smear of chocolate frosting on Liam's nose. We used too many sprinkles, and the layers were lopsided, but it was perfect. My expertise wasn't needed to analyze or document. It was just there to remember that letting a 6-year-old crack the eggs himself is more important than keeping the floor clean. The joy wasn't a performance. It was real and sticky and smelled like melted chocolate. I was no longer an expert witness or a general. I was just grandma. It was the most liberating promotion I could have ever imagined. The final, most meaningful confirmation that we had done the right thing came from Liam's first-grade teacher. Mark called me one evening, his voice thick with emotion. He told me that Ms. Albright had pulled him aside after school. She had wanted to tell him what a remarkable turnaround she'd seen in Liam over the past month. The anxious, quiet little boy who rarely spoke up was now raising his hand, volunteering to help other kids, and was the heart of a little group of friends on the playground. She told Mark that whatever had changed at home, it was working. She said he was blossoming. Hearing that, I felt the last knot of tension in my soul finally unwind. We hadn't just won a custody battle. We had given a little boy his childhood back. That was the only victory that ever truly mattered. In the end, what Dorothy learned was that when family is threatened by manipulation, the most powerful weapon isn't anger but alliance. She and her son, armed with his quiet courage and her forgotten expertise, formed the partnership their family truly needed. They didn't fight fire with fire. They fought psychological warfare with psychological facts. It was a testament to the idea that truth, when wielded with precision and love, is undeniable. They dismantled a fortress of fear not to punish the person inside it, but to rescue the child held captive. And that she knew is what real partnership looks like.